heart to ache for their pain. 11 years on, many parents passed away without having this one last look at their loved ones. Children growing without the warmth and protection of their fathers, and wives who forgot what happiness means. The psychological pain they all endure is 100 times more than their physical and mental deterioration. Endless attacks on their faith, dignity and honour. How long more do they have to pay off their lives for that which they are not aware of? Entering their 5th week of hunger strike, we are all here to support them and get them to know they are not alone. They are in every thought of ours, and we will not rest until they are back to where they should be, their homes and among their loved ones. That's Omar Dagayes. I'd like to welcome a representative now from the Stop the War Coalition. They have constantly supported our campaigns, and I think it's really good that this big organisation maintains regular contact with the small human rights groups like ours that keep going with individual or small campaigns. So Jim, would you like to come from Stop the War? Thank you.
Thanks. I think it's absolutely appropriate that Stop the War has been asked to say a few words, because you cannot make any sense of the absurdities of Guantanamo unless you grasp the absurdities of the war on terror. And you remember the sequence of events, the events in New York and Washington on September the 11th, 2001. And then Bush said, we will find those who did it and we will bring them to justice. And he had no intention, because at the same breath he said, we will fight this war on terror. And that's the phrase war on terror came up. And actually it was a repeat of the war on terror of the Reagan years. Some people here may remember it. The United States raised this slogan, war on terror. And there was that moment in 1986, in April of 1986, somebody set off a bomb in a discotheque in Berlin, and Reagan said, the Libyans did it. And he didn't have to prove anything, and they bombed Libya. And that produced an enormous reaction in this country. And then in June of that year, the International Court of Justice ruled on the petition of Nicaragua, the poorest country in the Americas, that the United States was waging what it called military and paramilitary activities against it. Actually, what they meant was a terrorist war, but since the property of the United States is to use the term terrorism, is not given to anybody else to petition for that. So they used military and paramilitary activities, and they went to the International Court of Justice, which debated for 2 years, and in June of 1986 found against the United States and said the United States must stop and must pay Nicaragua $17 billion in compensation. And the United States said, well, in that case, we don't recognize the International Court of Justice. And here we are, 25 years later, and the United States has not paid 1 penny of that $17 billion. And that set the thing up 30 years ago for this monster called the War on Terror. And then it kind of died down a bit, but they set up various institutions. They produced a list of states. They said these are the list of state sponsors of terror. The most prominent country not on it, of course, was the United States itself. But that's the point. That's the whole point. The United States and its allies get to tell you who and what is terrorism and what shall be done to them, and nobody else gets a say in the matter. So on September the 14th, 2001, Bush was given by Congress this thing called the Authorization for the Use of Force. And it said the President can decide who perpetrated September the 11th and what to do about it. And there are no holds barred. And then they started issuing a list of legal memoranda. There was the one about the military commissions. So Condoleezza Rice said the United States is now in an existential struggle like it's only ever been twice in its history in 225 years. That was the Civil War and the Second World War. And in the Civil War and the Second World War, we had military commissions. We've never had them before, we never had them since, but now we can have them. And they set them up. And then in January 2002, they said, right, any prisoners taken in this war on terror are not subject to anything we've ever signed before, like the Geneva Convention. They said it renders the Geneva Conventions quaint. And then they set up Guantanamo. And if you remember what they said, what Rumsfeld said, he said, this Guantanamo, this is just for the worst of the worst. So it's not for the bad, it's not for the worst, it's not for the worst, it's the worst of the worst. All the other ones go elsewhere. And then to rub it in, all the prisoners they'd accumulated, bought and paid for at $5,000 a head, most of which they hadn't captured themselves. They just scattered leaflets over Afghanistan and Pakistan, and they said, give us the prisoners, the terrorists, and your village will get a well, your village will get a school, and you will get $5,000. And Pervez Musharraf, the military president dictator of Pakistan at the time, wrote a book, and he said, look how many millions of dollars we got from the United States as a bounty. And he says, and if you don't believe me, ask the CIA. And that was in his book 6 years ago. So they took them to Guantanamo and they shackled them and they dressed them in orange suits and goggles and blindfolds and shackled. And they said that we have to do this because these are the people, said General Myers, who would bite through the hydraulic lines on an aeroplane if you didn't do that to them. And then they took them to Guantanamo and they took ultimately nearly 800 of them. And then they tried to implement these military commissions. And of the 800 prisoners so far, they have managed to so-called convict 7. And that includes a boy who was 15 years old at the time, an Australian sheep shearer who somehow got caught up in it and agreed to plead guilty if they gave him 9 months in Australia, and so on. And there are these 7, and they did Osama bin Laden's driver, supposedly. And you think about it, this is supposed to be modelled on the extreme crisis of the Second World War. So what did they do to the Nazis, who they captured at the end of the Second World War? Did they do, for example, Hitler's photographer? You remember the woman called Leni Riefenstahl who did the pictures of the Nuremberg rallies? Brilliant contribution to cinematography. Did they do her? No. But they did a man who supposedly ran a website that was somehow connected to Osama bin Laden. Did they do, for example, Hitler's secretary, a woman called Traudl Junge, who lived to a ripe old age and was still on the television 2 and 3 years ago till she died? No, they didn't, but they did somebody who's supposedly Osama bin Laden's driver. And that's the absurdity of it, because the whole of the war on terror is an absurdity. There isn't any part of the war on terror that you look at and you find that it makes any sense. And the point about making no sense is it's meant to make no sense, in the sense that there is now a superpower and we will tell you what terrorism is. We will tell you what should happen to terrorists. If we blind them and shackle them and whatever, that's because we say it's necessary and it doesn't matter. And any part of the war on terror that you take up is necessary and essential to do. And I commend the Guantanamo campaign. It's a necessary and component part. Please carry on to victory. We must defeat, we must close Guantanamo, and we must end the war on terror. Thank you.